The Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962 is directly responsible for the internet impact and subsequent popularity of this meme of Robert Pattinson. Yes, you heard me correctly. Before we get into that though, my name is Mr. Scar, and if you want to see more video content like this, please feel free to hit the like and subscribe button as my channel is just starting out. So without further ado, let's get into it. The Cuban Missile Crisis was an incredibly tense standoff between the United States and the USSR over the course of 13 days from October 16th to October 28th in 1962. It is largely regarded as the closest the world has ever come to a full-scale nuclear war, and if it hadn't been prevented, the consequences would have been dire, to say the least. Following the victory of the Allied powers in World War II, the United States, Great Britain, and Russia weren't on the best terms. The ideological divide between capitalism and socialism had plagued their relationship throughout the war, and these conflicts would only become stronger as time went on. Great Britain and America seemed to unite against Russia, seeking to stand their ground and prevent the spread of communism into the newly liberated territory as much as possible. U.S. General Patton famously suggested advancing into Russia, seeking to conquer the territory in a similar way to Japan and Germany. While this idea was largely disregarded due to the excessive casualties already and the danger of escalating into an even larger war, British officials had even bigger ideas. In 1945, Prime Minister Winston Churchill ordered the development of a secret project, coined Operation Unthinkable, which detailed the plans of a joint attack on Russia by the United States and Great Britain. Thankfully, this operation was never approved, and the Paris Peace Treaties were signed in 1947, which divided German territory among the Allied powers. However, this solution was imperfect to say the least. Tensions still remained high, and the Cold War between Russia and America had begun, fighting with threats of nuclear missiles and propaganda instead of any actual warfare. While tensions remained the same for years, the Russian occupation of Cuba made things extremely complicated for both countries. As communism spread into the country through the Cuban Revolution in the late 1950s, the U.S. government became concerned with the effect that it could have on American culture. After a series of paramilitary attacks on the country to deter communism, President John F. Kennedy launched the Bay of Pigs operation, which attempted to seize the country through military force. This operation failed and left Cuban-American relations at the worst state they had been in years. In response to this, communist revolutionary and self-appointed Prime Minister Fidel Castro requested more missiles from Russia. The amount of missiles sent over to Cuba grew in number throughout 1961 and 1962, as Cuba was in a strategic position that allowed Russia to potentially reach all of America with nuclear missiles. The Soviets assumed that after the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation, Kennedy would be cautious when engaging in the conflict. In the summer of 1962, the United States began to realize what was happening. On October 16, 1962, President John F. Kennedy was notified of the construction of these nuclear missiles due to photos taken by U-2 surveillance aircraft over the region. Kennedy convened with a group of military officials and politicians, including his brother Robert Kennedy, to come up with a plan. The idea of the Soviets placing missiles in Cuba had never even been considered by the Kennedy administration, and the Joint Chief of Staff unanimously decided that an invasion was the only rational option. Kennedy disagreed. Worried about further conflict but still needing to take a firm stand against the Soviets, Kennedy ordered for a naval blockade to surround Cuba and prevent further imports from Russia on October 22nd. Later that day, Kennedy made the first official statement to the American people, obviously causing widespread fear and panic among the American people and the entire world. For days, tensions were incredibly high, as the Soviets debated threatening the blockade. Kennedy met with members of the United Nations on October 25th to discuss the possibility of a truce, only if Russia agreed to remove all of their missiles from Cuba. However, tensions rose later that day when CIA operatives reported to Kennedy that missiles were still being built and that numerous Russian ships had been heading towards the blockade. Kennedy became worried of a full-scale invasion being the only option, but on October 26th, the Department of State received a handwritten letter from Soviet Prime Minister Nikita Khrushchev detailing a compromise. Russian and American emissaries agreed to meet in Washington, D.C. to discuss their options, and on the 27th, the United States sent a modified proposal back to Khrushchev. Later that day, the United States Navy dropped a series of signaling charges on a Russian submarine, which unbeknownst to them, was armed with nuclear missiles. The submarine assumed the charges were armed and proposed to launch the missiles. The commanding officer of the sub, however, Vasily Arkhipov, I butchered that pronunciation, decided against it, thereby averting an entire nuclear war and altering history forever. On October 28, 1962, the USSR agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, and the US secretly agreed to remove their missiles from Italy and Turkey. The blockade remained in place until proof of deconstruction of the missiles was confirmed. Crisis was averted, but the US and Soviet relations would remain tense for almost 30 years. While President Kennedy was no doubt instrumental to the Cuban Missile Crisis and preventing the nuclear war, he did face a lot of backlash, especially among pro-Cuban groups. These groups influenced many Americans as communism continued to spread throughout North America and Europe. Even though most Americans supported Kennedy's handling of the crisis, the consequences of his actions would be the death of him. Literally. Lee Harvey Oswald was born on October 18, 1939 in New Orleans. As a child, he struggled with discipline in school, even being diagnosed with schizoid and passive-aggressive tendencies by a psychiatrist as a teenager. In 1956, Oswald enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. While serving, many of his colleagues regarded him as strange, noticing his tendencies to communism and socialism, as well as a general distaste for the United States government. These tendencies would lead to his defection from the Marine Corps, eventually even becoming a Soviet citizen. In 1961, Oswald and his wife, whom he met in Russia, moved back to the United States to the DFW area, or Dallas-Fort Worth. On November 22, 1963, at 12:30 p.m., Oswald fired 3 shots at President Kennedy as his motorcade passed through the Dealey Plaza. He shot from the 6th floor of the Texas Book Depository building. Or at least that's what the CIA says. Anyways, he was arrested shortly afterward and was questioned by the police almost immediately. A few days later, on November 24, 1963, Oswald was shot by a Dallas nightclub owner while being escorted out of the jail by police officers. Oswald's communist tendencies were extremely apparent, as he was sympathetic to both Russia and Cuba during the Cold War. The Kennedy assassination actually was the second murder he had attempted, as he had attempted to assassinate retired Army General Edwin Walker earlier that year, largely due to his political leanings as a conservative. Many people have theorized his connection to Fidel Castro as well, as he was sympathetic to Cuba and was even spotted handing out flyers in support of Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro himself stated later in his life that he believes the Kennedy assassination was caused because of his actions in Cuba. The handling of the Bay of Pigs operation, as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis, left a bad taste in communist mouth, and it no doubt contributed to his untimely death. Following Kennedy's death, the Warren Commission was established to investigate the assassination. The commission was highly secretive and was led by California Governor Earl Warren. The commission concluded that Oswald had shot 3 bullets, one of which hit Kennedy, and the other of which hit Texas Governor John Connally. To this day, the official documents have yet to be released from this commission, leading to speculation on whether or not the US government knew about it or was even involved in the assassination. One theory is that the CIA was involved in the assassination due to political disagreements with Kennedy. Some speculate that the CIA had ties to the Mafia and was able to hire Mafia members to carry out the assassination. The main proof of this was the connection of Jack Ruby, the nightclub owner who shot Oswald on November 24th, to the Mafia. However, one man who is also brought up in this speculation is none other than President George Bush. At the time of the Kennedy assassination, George Bush was a wealthy oilman in Texas, and although he was not in Dallas at the time of the event, he is often pointed to as a collaborator. J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI mentioned a man from the CIA named George Bush in a memo during the Warren Commission, though the former president has denied his involvement, claiming that there was another man of the same name. There obviously isn't enough evidence available to the public to determine Bush's involvement in the conspiracy against Kennedy, but it is an interesting detail. Bush was extremely active in the Republican Party in Texas throughout the 60s and 70s, and prior to the 1980 election, Ronald Reagan even named him as his running mate. In 1981, Reagan was sworn in as President of the United States, and Bush became Vice President. As Vice President, Bush took a hard stand against the spread of communism, as the Cold War was in full force. Reagan's conservative political leanings appealed to many Americans, and the administration's hard stance on communism led to the resolutions of many conflicts. This led to Reagan's re-election in 1984, and in 1988, George Bush was elected president himself. Despite many criticisms of his presidency, in 1990, Bush met with Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Gorbachev, officially ending the Cold War, and Germany was reunified into one country. The peace resolution was widely celebrated across the world, but it did lead to consequences. United States and Soviet involvement in the Middle East during the Cold War had led to many extremist groups, and in August of 1990, Soviet-backed Iraq invaded Kuwait, starting the Persian Gulf War. With aid from the United Nations, Bush was able to lead a coalition against Iraq and sent 500,000 US soldiers to the Persian Gulf region to defend Kuwait. When Iraq refused to surrender, Bush ordered Operation Desert Storm, which began on January 17, 1991. U.S. bombers conducting a bombing campaign on Iraqi bases, and by late February, Iraq had retreated from Kuwait, leading to another United States victory and ending the Persian Gulf War. Bush's handling of the Persian Gulf War and the U.S. economy were controversial to say the least, and he lost to Bill Clinton in 1992. Clinton served 2 terms with mixed approval ratings, and in 2000, George W. Bush, George Bush's son, was elected president. It's confusing, I get it. Bush defeated Democrat politician Al Gore by a narrow margin and took office in 2001. Bush was a popular figure in the Republican Party due to his extensive political experience, but, nepotism. For the most part, Bush's presidency was somewhat unremarkable, except for one key event early on in his presidency. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists organized by Osama bin Laden hijacked 4 commercial airliners, effectively becoming suicide bombers. It was one of the largest terrorist attacks in history, and its effects can be felt throughout the world to this day. At 8:46 a.m., the first airliner crashed into the side of the World Trade Center in New York, with a second plane crashing into the other tower at 9:03 a.m. Shortly afterwards, another plane crashed into the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m. The final flight was heading towards the White House. At this point, news of the attacks had spread worldwide, and when the passengers of United Airlines Flight 93 were hijacked by these terrorists, they figured out what was happening quickly. The passengers organized a swift attack on the terrorists and took control of the cockpit, crashing the plane into a field in Pennsylvania in a heroic sacrifice. President George W. Bush had been informed of the attacks while reading a story to children in elementary school, but he acted incredibly swiftly. His reaction to the attacks were praised by Democrats and Republicans alike, with his approval rating going all the way up to 90% during this period. Bush pledged a global war on terror, establishing the Department of Homeland Security and ordered a bombing campaign on Afghanistan. This began the War on Terror, which continued all the way until 2021, when President Biden removed the troops from Afghanistan. In addition to this, Bush authorized the National Security Agency to monitor American emails and phone calls, signing the Patriot Act on October 26, 2001. As the first plane hit the World Trade Center, musician Gerard Way was riding on a train in New York City. Witnessing the events, he was shocked and felt like he was in a science fiction movie. The event inspired him to quit his day job as a cartoonist and began writing songs. He recruited his younger brother and bassist Mikey Way, drummer Matt Pellissier, and guitarist Ray Toro into his band, which they coined My Chemical Romance, after a book Mikey Way found at Barnes & Noble. The band signed with independent label Eyeball Records and released their debut album, I Brought You Bullets, You Brought Me Your Love, in 2002. The album became a small success, but the band signed with Reprised Records in 2003, which was a much better deal. As discontent with President Bush grew, a new musical movement emerged in America. Bands such as Green Day were extremely outspoken against Bush's handling of the War on Terror, and My Chemical Romance fit right into this scene, releasing their landmark album, Welcome to the Black Parade, on October 23, 2006, 5 years after the formation of the band and the events of 9/11. The album went on to be a commercial and critical success worldwide, selling over 4 million copies. The Black Parade tour. However, another important piece of the puzzle came through British rock band Muse, who toured with My Chemical Romance in 2006. Started by vocalist and guitarist Matt Bellamy, bassist Chris Wolstenholme, and drummer Dominic Howard in 1994, the band blended alternative, progressive rock, and metal into their signature sound. Often compared to the band Radiohead in their early years, they sought to create their own identity through the early 2000s. In 2001, Muse released their second album, Origin of Symmetry, which propelled them into fame worldwide in alternative circles. Even though their sound was wildly different from bands such as My Chemical Romance and Green Day, they fit into the alternative and emo scenes extremely well, influencing them significantly. The band would also go on to release 2004's Absolution and 2006's Black Holes and Revelations, which would become even more successful than their previous albums. And the band also served as a massive influence to Gerard Way in the early years of My Chemical Romance. But you're probably asking yourself, why are these bands important? Well, in 2003, author Stephanie Meyer had a dream about a young girl who fell in love with a vampire. Inspired by this dream, she began writing what would later become the book series Twilight. A huge fan of emo music herself, she often listened to music while she wrote, citing Muse and My Chemical Romance as some of the biggest inspirations for the series. Her draft was submitted to publishers, and in 2005, the first Twilight novel released, eventually reaching number 1 on the New York Times bestseller list. With this success, she went on to release 3 more books in the series, New Moon, Eclipse, and Breaking Dawn, all of which led to commercial success. In 2008, a film adaptation of the first novel was released, to mixed reception. Starring relatively unknown actors Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson as the lead roles, it grossed over $400 million worldwide and was a big success. The series would go on to release films based on the other books as well, all of which led to major commercial successes and even featured songs by many of Meyer's favorite artists, including Muse. My Chemical Romance did not agree to use their songs in this movie. However, while the movies were commercially successful, it was received very poorly among critics. Many critics disliked the movie for its poorly written story and dialogue, and it affected the reputation of the actors involved in the film. Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson had a very difficult time receiving roles in the films for years after this. However, they were both talented actors and kept going. Robert Pattinson in particular had to reinvent the wheel after the failure of Twilight. While Pattinson had played roles in major films before Twilight, such as Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, Twilight was his first major lead role in a blockbuster film. After being criticized for his lackluster performance, Pattinson failed to get roles in major films, instead focusing on smaller indie films and TV shows. After years of flying under the radar, Pattinson began to gain a cult following due to his acting, as he improved significantly over the years. In 2018, Pattinson was cast in Robert Eggers' horror film, The Lighthouse, alongside Willem Dafoe. The movie was a critical success, and many people started to realize Pattinson's acting skills once again because of it. Following The Lighthouse, Pattinson was cast in Christopher Nolan's blockbuster Tenet, which propelled his career even further and proved his versatility as an actor. Tenet was the biggest commercial success for Pattinson since Twilight, and it brought him back to the mainstream audiences. But his biggest success would be achieved the following year in 2020. Robert Pattinson was cast in the lead role in Matt Reeves' The Batman in 2020, which reinvented the classic Batman story with a much darker and grittier feel than the previous movies. The Batman was much more grounded than any of its predecessors, and Pattinson was chosen because of his versatility in his previous roles and the dramatic presence he would bring to the character. Weirdly enough, if it weren't for Twilight and his role as a vampire in the movie, he probably wouldn't have gotten the role. The darker tone of Batman led to a different approach to the character. The Batman served as a second chance for him, and he gave it everything he had. The film released on March 4th, 2022, to critical success, and pushed Pattinson into the mainstream once again. After the release of The Batman, the internet did what the internet does, and made memes about it. Many fans took advantage of the song Something in the Way by Nirvana, which was featured in the film, parodying it. You know what, I'm tired of being serious about this, I'm just gonna play you the clip.
Something's in my ass.
Anyways, the memes became very popular online, and the picture of Robert Pattinson in a tracksuit started circulating. And over time, Pattinson started to be incorporated into the Sigma male trend. If you don't know what a Sigma male is, well, good for you. But basically, it stemmed from influencers such as Andrew Tate, who wanted to bring back traditional masculinity and reject modern feminism by basically buying a bunch of crypto and driving a Bugatti to escape the Matrix. Obviously, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but many people, especially young men, started following him religiously. The idea of the Sigma male stemmed from the alpha and beta male trend, with Sigma serving as like a lone wolf figure and rejecting society. Yeah, these guys are real winners, aren't they? Memes about being a Sigma male started circling online, with internet users associating themselves with characters such as Patrick Bateman from American Psycho and the Joker. Most of these memes are pretty ironic, but they gained a lot of traction on social media such as YouTube Shorts and TikTok. With the release of the Barbie movie in 2023, Ryan Gosling's character of Ken was identified as a Sigma male by these online communities. It was added to the list of Sigma males. I feel so stupid saying this right now. A bunch of other people started identifying with literally me, Sigma Alpha Mojo Jojo Ryan Gosling, and it was all over the internet. So what's the big deal, and what does this have to do with anything? Well, over the past month or so, Robert Pattinson has been adding to this trend, specifically because of this clip. This clip originates from a cologne commercial from a few years back, but the internet did its thing and edited the crap out of it, and if you're at all online, you've probably seen this before. Usually it's edited with the caption like, "My honest reaction" or literally "me," but as silly as it sounds, it shows his talent as an actor more than anything else. His performance is so memorable, and it's had such an effect on people, that even years after its release, people are still making memes about him mewing along with the caption, "My honest reaction." Why did I just say that out loud? So, in case you weren't paying attention, the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962 created a chain reaction that led to the political tension between Russia and America during the Cold War, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963, the election of George Bush and his son, multiple wars in the Middle East, 9/11, My Chemical Romance, Twilight, Ultra Sigma Patrick Bateman, Skibbity Toilet Ryan Gosling, and eventually this meme of Robert Pattinson. What am I doing with my life? With that being said, if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like it, please feel free to like and subscribe to the channel, as this is like literally my second video. This channel is just starting out, and if you want to see more, it really would mean the most. Also, I do have a Spotify, so if you want to check out my description or my profile, the link is there. I really would appreciate it if you're at all interested in alternative rock or shoegaze music. I guarantee you'll like it. Without further ado, thank you for watching and see you in the next video.